The crash of breaking glass echoed through the vast hallway of the Montgomery estate. Thaddeus didn't flinch as the priceless Ming vase shattered against the wall inches from his head. "Get out, all of you," he roared, his voice thundering through the mansion. "3 medical degrees between you, and you can't even tell me what's wrong with my daughter?" The team of specialists exchanged glances, gathering their equipment with practiced efficiency. They weren't the first medical professionals to be expelled from the Montgomery fortress. Dr. Eleanor Winters, the lead physician, stepped forward while her colleagues retreated. "Mr. Montgomery, Violetta's condition is extremely rare. We need more time too." "Time is the one thing my daughter doesn't have." Thaddeus cut her off, the bags under his eyes testament to sleepless nights. "I'll find someone who actually knows what they're doing." As the medical team filed out, Maxwell Reed, his personal physician and oldest friend, remained, leaning against the doorframe of Thaddeus's study. "That's the 5th team this month, Thad," Maxwell said, his voice carrying the weight of concern rather than judgment. Thaddeus collapsed into his leather chair, eyes fixed on the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. 3 years since Claire's death, and now Violetta, his only remaining anchor to humanity, was slipping away too. "I don't care if I have to hire every specialist in the country. Someone has to know how to treat her." Maxwell approached the desk, sliding a folder across the polished surface. "There's someone you haven't tried yet." Thaddeus didn't reach for the folder. "Another Harvard-educated failure?" "No, an RN with unconventional methods. She's had remarkable success with cases similar to Violetta's." "A nurse?" Thaddeus scoffed. "I've had the world's top specialists in this house, and they've all failed," Maxwell reminded him quietly. "Eliana Valente approaches illness differently. She treats the whole person, not just the symptoms." Thaddeus finally glanced at the folder. "Sounds like New Age nonsense. 3 months ago, she helped a teenager with an undiagnosed condition similar to Violetta's. The girl had been to Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, everywhere. Now she's back in school." Maxwell tapped the folder. "What do you have to lose?" Before Thaddeus could answer, his phone rang. Violetta's personal monitor. He snatched it up, face draining of color as he listened. "She's having another episode," he said, already moving. "Call whoever you want, Max. Just do something." Upstairs, Violetta's room had been converted into a high-tech medical suite. The 14-year-old lay in her bed, skin pale as the sheets around her, dark hair a stark contrast. Monitors beeped ominously as a private nurse tried to stabilize her. "Daddy." Violetta's voice was thin, a mere whisper. Thaddeus took her hand, forcing his features into a reassuring smile. "I'm here, Vi. Am I going to die like Mom?" The question stabbed through him. "No, absolutely not." Her blue eyes, Claire's eyes, searched his face for the truth. "Promise. I promise," he said, the weight of that vow settling on his shoulders. Violetta didn't need to know that Claire's helicopter crash hadn't killed her instantly, that she'd lingered for hours in a Boston hospital while he was stuck in a meeting in New York, unreachable. He wouldn't fail Violetta the same way. Later that night, after Violetta had been sedated, Thaddeus found Maxwell waiting in his study, phone in hand. "She's willing to start tomorrow," Maxwell said without preamble. Thaddeus poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. "The nurse, Eliana Valente. She's canceling her other cases." Thaddeus downed the drink. "Fine. But the second she starts talking about crystals or chakras, she's gone." "She's not like that," Maxwell insisted. "But Thad, there's something else you should know." He hesitated. "She has conditions." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. "She's dictating terms to me?" "She insists on full authority over Violetta's treatment plan. No interference." "That's absurd. It's my daughter, my house. And nothing you've tried has worked," Maxwell pointed out. "She also wants Violetta's living space modified. More natural light, fewer restrictions on visitors, changes to the dietary plan." Thaddeus glared at his friend. "Anything else? Perhaps she'd like the deed to the house while she's at it?" "She wants you involved in the treatment." That stopped him. "What does that mean?" "It means you can't keep hiding in your office while strangers care for your daughter. Eliana believes Violetta's condition has emotional components that require your presence." For a moment, Thaddeus was silent, remembering Claire's accusation during their last phone call. "You're never present, Thad, even when you're in the room." "Fine," he finally said. "She has 1 month to show results." Maxwell nodded, relief evident. "I'll let her know." She'll be here at 8 tomorrow. After Maxwell left, Thaddeus stood at the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. Outside, a security guard patrolled the perimeter, one of many he'd hired since Claire's death. The Newport mansion had become a fortress, designed to keep danger out. He never considered that the real threat might already be inside. Eliana Valente stood at the wrought iron gates of the Montgomery estate, duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Security cameras tracked her every movement as she waited for the guard to verify her credentials. "Seems excessive," she muttered, taking in the fortress-like security measures. The guard's suspicious gaze swept over her simple navy dress and practical shoes, clearly expecting someone more imposing than the petite woman before him. "Mr. Montgomery values his privacy," he replied curtly, returning her ID. "Follow the main drive. Miss Keating will meet you at the entrance." The walk to the main house revealed immaculate gardens devoid of any signs of life or joy. No garden toys, no evidence that a child lived here. Just perfectly trimmed hedges and calculated beauty without warmth. Cecilia Keating, the house manager, waited on the steps, her posture rigid as a sentinel. "Ms. Valente. Punctual. Good. Just Eliana, please. Mr. Montgomery prefers formality with staff." Cecilia led her through the foyer, rattling off rules with machine gun precision. "Violetta's quarters are on the second floor, east wing. Staff uses the service stairs. Meals are taken in the kitchen. Mr. Montgomery works from home, but is not to be disturbed. Medical reports are submitted daily. Questions?" Eliana paused by a massive window whose heavy drapes blocked what should have been a spectacular ocean view. "Why is everything so dark in here?" Cecilia's expression tightened. "Violetta is photosensitive." "According to whose diagnosis?" "Dr. Winters determined." "Dr. Winters is no longer treating Violetta," Eliana interrupted, pulling back the drapes. Sunlight flooded the room. "First rule of my treatment plan, we let light in. Actual photosensitivity is extremely rare in autoimmune conditions like Violetta's. Depression from isolation, however, is common." Cecilia looked horrified. "Mr. Montgomery specifically instructed. I have full authority over Violetta's treatment plan," Eliana reminded her. "That includes her environment. Now, I'd like to meet my patient." Upstairs, Violetta's suite resembled a hospital room more than a teenager's sanctuary. Medical equipment surrounded the bed where the girl lay reading, her thin frame almost disappearing beneath the covers. "Another doctor?" Violetta sighed without looking up. "Worse, a nurse," Eliana replied, dropping her bag with a theatrical thud. "One who hates hospitals and thinks your room needs a serious makeover." That got the girl's attention. Violetta lowered her book, revealing eyes too old for her young face. "Dad won't allow it. Your dad hired me to help you get better, and that's what I'm going to do." Eliana opened the blinds, letting sunlight stream in, starting with actual daylight. Violetta squinted, then slowly smiled. "I haven't seen the ocean from my window in months. Crime against humanity, blocking that view." Eliana perched on the edge of the bed. "I read your file, but I'd rather hear from you. How do you feel? Not your symptoms, but you." The question clearly caught Violetta off guard. "Trapped," she finally admitted. "Scared. Bored. Good. Honesty. We'll work with that." Eliana glanced at the monitoring equipment. "These stay for now, but we're adding some normal teenage stuff. What did you like before you got sick?" "Music. Drawing. I had a guitar." "Absolutely not," came a deep voice from the doorway. Thaddeus Montgomery filled the frame, his expression thunderous as he surveyed the sunlit room. "What is going on here?" Eliana stood, extending her hand. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm Eliana Valente." He ignored her hand. "You've been here 15 minutes, and you're already countermanding established protocols." "Ineffective protocols," she corrected. "Your daughter isn't photosensitive. She's suffering from environmental depression on top of her autoimmune issues. You determined this in your thorough 15-minute assessment. I reviewed her files last night. The photosensitivity diagnosis was speculation that became protocol without proper testing." Eliana held his gaze. "If you want a nurse who just follows outdated orders, I'm not your person." For a moment, the room crackled with tension. Violetta watched wide-eyed, clearly unused to anyone challenging her father. "1 week," Thaddeus finally said. "You have 1 week to show improvement with these methods. Then we reevaluate." 2 weeks minimum, Eliana countered. And I'll need your involvement. His jaw tightened. I'm involved. I pay the bills. Physically present. In this room. Daily. She softened her tone. Violetta's condition has emotional components. Healing happens in relationship. My schedule. Dad, Violetta interrupted, her voice small but determined. Please try. I'm tired of feeling awful. Something shifted in Thaddeus's expression, a crack in the armor. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months. 2 weeks, he conceded. But the monitors stay, and any significant changes to medication require my approval. Fair enough. Eliana turned back to Violetta. Now, about that guitar. That evening, Eliana found herself in the kitchen, preparing a pot of her grandmother's Portuguese soup. The cook had initially protested the intrusion, but relented when Eliana explained the therapeutic benefits of homemade broth for autoimmune conditions. That smells unfamiliar, Thaddeus said from the doorway. Eliana glanced up. Caldo verde, my grandmother's recipe, full of nutrients Violetta needs. The nutritionist created a specific meal plan. That she's not eating, Eliana finished. Food is medicine only if it's consumed. Thaddeus approached, studying the simmering pot with suspicion. You're changing a lot very quickly. Violetta needs change. Quickly, Eliana handed him a spoon. Taste. He hesitated, then complied. Surprise flickered across his face. It's good. Don't sound so shocked, she laughed, the sound so unexpected in the solemn house that Thaddeus actually flinched. Mr. Montgomery, your daughter played her guitar for 30 minutes today. Her cortisol levels dropped measurably. Whatever we've been doing wrong, we've been doing it for a while. Time to try something new. For a moment, something unguarded crossed his face. Hope, perhaps, or fear of hope. She doesn't know about the nights, he said quietly. When I sit with her after she's asleep. Eliana paused in her stirring. She needs to know you're there when she's awake. He nodded once, then turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. The soup. Bring enough for 2. After he left, Eliana released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Behind the Bitter Billionaire's facade was a broken father terrified of losing his daughter. That man she could work with. What she couldn't share was the real reason she'd taken this job. The whispered words of a dying woman 3 years ago, words that had haunted her ever since. Tell Thaddeus he was right about the system. He was right. Claire Montgomery's last words deserved answers. But first, Eliana had a daughter to heal. Progress report, Thaddeus demanded, entering Violetta's room unannounced 2 weeks after Eliana's arrival. Eliana didn't look up from the blood pressure cuff she was removing from Violetta's arm. Blood pressure improved by 8 points. Weight gain of 2 pounds. Sleep quality up 30%. Is that sufficient? For someone who nearly died last month? Yes. Eliana recorded the numbers in her chart. Violetta, why don't you show your father what you worked on this morning? The girl reached for a sketchbook on her nightstand. Thaddeus took it, flipping through pages of increasingly detailed drawings. The ocean view from her window, the gardens below, a portrait of Eliana laughing. I didn't know you were still drawing, he said quietly. Ms. Valente got me new supplies. Violetta's voice held a tentative pride. She says creating things helps the immune system. Thaddeus raised an eyebrow at Eliana. Is that medically proven? Creative expression reduces stress hormones, she replied. And yes, it's peer-reviewed science, not New Age nonsense as you initially feared. A faint flush colored his cheeks at having his words quoted back to him. 2 more weeks, he conceded. Keep me updated daily. After he left, Violetta sighed. That's the longest conversation we've had in months. He's trying, Eliana said, though she'd seen the way his eyes lingered on his daughter's artwork. There was more to Thaddeus Montgomery than the cold exterior suggested. Later that evening, storm clouds gathered over Newport. Eliana was in the library researching treatment options when lightning struck nearby, plunging the mansion into darkness. Perfect, she muttered, using her phone's flashlight to navigate toward the door. She collided with a solid form entering the room. Power's out in the whole neighborhood, Thaddeus said, steadying her with hands on her shoulders. Generators should kick in momentarily for the medical equipment. As if on cue, partial power returned, bathing the library in dim light. Outside, rain lashed against the windows with mounting ferocity. How's Violetta? Eliana asked. Sleeping through it. The new medication seems to be helping. He didn't move away, his hands still resting lightly on her shoulders. When he realized this, he stepped back abruptly. I should check the backup systems. I've been meaning to ask you about her medical history before the onset, Eliana said, stopping him. The records are incomplete. Lightning illuminated the room, casting harsh shadows across his face. What specifically? Family history. Her mother's side. His expression closed. Claire was in perfect health until the accident. Sometimes genetic factors only manifest in certain circumstances. Eliana hesitated. I'm trying to get the full picture. Thunder rumbled as Thaddeus moved to the window, watching the storm rage. There's nothing in Claire's history that would help Violetta. How can you be certain? Because I had everything investigated after she got sick. The words burst from him with unexpected intensity. Every possibility, every treatment, every specialist. I've covered every angle. Except yourself, Eliana said quietly. He turned sharply, meaning, when was the last time you actually sat with her? Not checking monitors or discussing symptoms, just being her father. The question hung between them, punctuated by another crash of thunder. I was in New York when Claire's helicopter went down, he finally said, his voice so low Eliana had to strain to hear it. Board meeting for a new medical device. She called during the presentation, but I didn't answer. Eliana felt her breath catch. You couldn't have known. She was worried about the weather. The pilot had concerns. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. I got the messages 3 hours later. By then, she was already at Boston Memorial, unresponsive. Eliana froze at the mention of the hospital where she'd worked. I'm sorry. Violetta looks at me and sees the father who wasn't there when her mother needed him. His voice remained controlled, but his knuckles whitened against the window frame. She doesn't say it, but I see it. Children are more resilient than we give them credit for, Eliana offered. But they need presence, not perfection. He turned to face her, his expression raw in the dim light. And what do you know about it? I know loss, she said simply. My father died when I was 12. My last words to him were, I hate you, because he wouldn't let me go to a friend's party. Something shifted in Thaddeus's gaze, recognition of a shared wound. The night Claire died, he continued, the confession seemingly unstoppable now. I was finalizing the acquisition of a medical technology that could have revolutionized emergency response. The irony isn't lost on me. Eliana stepped closer. You can't change the past, but Violetta's still here. She needs you now. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her. Instead, he moved to the fireplace, methodically arranging logs. Tell me about your approach with Violetta, he said, changing the subject as he struck a match. No one else has made progress. I'm treating her whole system, not just the symptoms. Eliana settled into a leather chair as the fire caught. Her isolation was making everything worse. The specialists recommended limiting exposure to potential infections. At the cost of everything that makes life worth living? The fire's glow softened her features. Healing isn't just physical. Thaddeus studied her with new interest. Where did you study? Brown for nursing, then specialized training in integrative medicine. She smiled slightly. Not quite the Harvard pedigree you're used to, but effective. Clearly. He hesitated. Have you always wanted to be a nurse? Since I was 8. My mother got sick, and the nurses were the ones who explained things to me, who made it less scary. She didn't add that this experience also drew her to Boston Memorial after graduation, to the trauma unit where Claire Montgomery had spent her final hours. The storm raged on, but within the library, something had changed. The silence between them was no longer hostile, but thoughtful. Maxwell was right about you, Thaddeus finally said. You're not what I expected. Is that a compliment, Mr. Montgomery? Thaddeus, he corrected, the firelight catching a hint of a smile. I think we've moved past formalities. When the main power finally returned hours later, Eliana realized they'd talked through the night. She'd learned about his rise from middle-class roots to tech visionary, his early courtship with Claire, his dreams for Violetta's future. In turn, she'd shared stories of her Portuguese grandmother's remedies, her work in pediatric care, her belief in treating beyond symptoms. What she couldn't share was how Claire's last words had led her here, or that the system failure Claire had mentioned might connect to the company Thaddeus had built. As dawn broke, something else became clear to Eliana. The complexity of her growing feelings for a man whose secrets might still destroy them both. Garrett Sinclair strode through the Montgomery Technologies headquarters in Boston, his tailored suit and confident smile concealing his unease. As chief operations officer and Thaddeus's oldest friend, he'd steered the company through the aftermath of Claire's death. Now, a month into Violetta's treatment with Eliana Valente, he was increasingly concerned by the changes in Thaddeus. He actually laughed during the video call yesterday, Garrett told his assistant, Jessica. Thad hasn't laughed in board meetings since before Claire died. Isn't that a good thing? Jessica asked, handing him a stack of contracts. It's unpredictable. We're finalizing the Meridian merger next month. I need him focused. Garrett paused at his office door. What do we know about this nurse? Eliana Valente, 32. Graduated top of her class from Brown. Specialized in pediatric autoimmune disorders. Impressive record. Jessica hesitated. Why? Just being thorough. Find out more, previous employment, personal history, anything unusual. Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. We protect Thad from those who might take advantage of his situation. In Newport, unaware of this conversation, Thaddeus watched as Eliana guided Violetta through gentle, strengthening exercises in the garden. His daughter's laugh floated across the lawn, a sound he'd feared he might never hear again. Her progress is remarkable, Maxwell said, joining him at the window. Eliana's methods are unorthodox, but they're working. She's gained 5 pounds. Blood markers improving weekly. Thaddeus couldn't take his eyes off the scene. But what happens when she leaves? Maxwell studied his friend. You're worried about more than just Violetta's health. Thaddeus didn't answer immediately. She brings light into rooms that have been dark for years, Max. And that scares you. Claire's been gone 3 years. Sometimes that feels like yesterday. Thaddeus turned from the window. Other times, when I'm talking with Eliana, it feels like I've been holding my breath since Claire died, and I'm finally remembering how to breathe. That's called healing, Thad. It's allowed. Their conversation was interrupted by Thaddeus's phone. Garrett's name flashed on the screen. With a slight frown, Thaddeus answered. I need you in Boston tomorrow, Garrett said without preamble. The Meridian team wants to renegotiate terms. Send the legal team. I'm staying with Violetta. This requires your personal touch. One day, Thad. I'll have the helicopter ready at 9. At the mention of a helicopter, Thaddeus tensed. Since Claire's accident, he'd refused to fly in them. I'll drive. Text me the details. After ending the call, he turned to find Maxwell watching him with concern. First time back to headquarters in months, Maxwell noted. Are you ready? It's just a meeting. But Thaddeus's expression suggested otherwise. Will you stay with Violetta while I'm gone? Of course, though she has Eliana now. Something flickered across Thaddeus's face. That's what worries me. She's becoming too attached to someone who's temporary in our lives. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. Is she? Temporary. Before Thaddeus could respond, Violetta burst into the room, cheeks flushed with healthy color. Dad, Ms. Valente says I can try the stairs to the beach tomorrow if my blood pressure stays stable. Thaddeus exchanged a look with Eliana, who had followed at a more measured pace. Is that safe? With supervision and frequent rest breaks, she confirmed. Movement is medicine. She's ready for more challenges. I have to go to Boston tomorrow, he told Violetta, whose face fell immediately. Just for the day? But you promised we'd play chess, she said quietly. The disappointment in her voice cut through him. Before Eliana, he would have explained the importance of the meeting, prioritizing business. Now, he found himself saying, I'll be back for dinner. We'll play then. Violetta brightened instantly. Promise. Promise. He met Eliana's approving gaze over his daughter's head, feeling something warm unfurl in his chest. After Violetta returned to her room to rest, Eliana lingered. First trip away since I arrived, she observed. Nervous. Should I be? Separating can be harder once you've started reconnecting. She stepped closer. She'll be fine. She's stronger than you think. It's not just Violetta I'm thinking about, he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. A faint blush colored Eliana's cheeks. I'll be here when you get back, Thaddeus. The way she said his name, like a promise itself, stayed with him long after she'd gone. That evening, Violetta discovered something strange while Thaddeus was reviewing documents for his trip. Dad, she appeared in his study doorway, holding a small black device. What's this? I found it behind my headboard. Thaddeus took the object, examining it with growing confusion. Where exactly did you find this? It was taped behind my bed. Is it some kind of medical monitor? No. His voice sharpened. It's a surveillance device. Like a spy camera? Violetta's eyes widened. Did you put it there? Absolutely not. He turned the device over, finding no identifying marks. Go back to your room. I'll handle this. After she left, Thaddeus called his security chief, who confirmed they hadn't installed any such devices. A thorough sweep revealed two more, one in the library where he and Eliana often talked, another in his home office. When Eliana learned of the discovery later that night, her first thought was of the conversations they'd had in those rooms. Who would do this? She asked, watching as the security team collected the devices. I have enemies, Thaddeus said grimly. Competitors. The timing with my trip to Boston tomorrow feels deliberate. Should you cancel? And let them know we've discovered the breach? No. We maintain normalcy while security investigates. His expression hardened. But I want you to stay close to Violetta tomorrow. Don't let her out of your sight. Eliana nodded, but internally, her mind raced. The listening devices complicated everything. Had someone heard her late-night research into Montgomery Technologies' history? Did they know she'd accessed files on the helicopter crash that killed Claire? After the security team left, Thaddeus walked Eliana to her room, both hyper-aware of potentially being watched or heard. I don't like leaving with this unresolved, he admitted quietly. We'll be careful, she promised. Focus on your meeting. At her door, he hesitated. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. The tension between them had been building for weeks. Instead, he touched her cheek briefly. Lock your door tonight, he said, then turned and walked away. Inside her room, Eliana leaned against the closed door, heart racing. She checked her secure email on her personal phone. The background search on Claire's accident had yielded new information. Something about the helicopter's navigation system, a proprietary technology developed by Montgomery Technologies' subsidiary. A system Claire had expressed concerns about, according to a former colleague. The same system being implemented in emergency vehicles as part of the Meridian merger Thaddeus was finalizing tomorrow. Eliana closed her eyes, conflict tearing at her. She'd come to the Montgomery estate seeking answers about Claire's cryptic last words. Instead, she'd found a broken family healing, a man she was falling for, and a mystery that grew darker by the day. Tomorrow, while Thaddeus was in Boston, she would need to risk everything to search his office for the truth before whoever planted those devices found it first. The moment Thaddeus's car disappeared down the driveway, Eliana felt the weight of dual responsibilities settle on her shoulders. Protect Violetta. Find the truth. Can we go down to the beach now? Violetta asked, practically bouncing with excitement at breakfast. Blood pressure check first, Eliana reminded her, pushing aside her plans to search Thaddeus's office. Violetta came first, always. The morning proceeded normally, medication, physical therapy, rest. By noon, Violetta's vitals looked strong enough for their beach expedition. Eliana packed a small medical kit, water, and snacks. Ready for an adventure? She asked, helping Violetta into a light jacket. The girl's smile was answer enough. They were halfway down the stairs to the private beach when the security system chimed, announcing a visitor. Strange, Eliana murmured. Were you expecting anyone? Violetta shook her head. Maybe it's Uncle Garrett. He sometimes visits when Dad's away. They returned to the main house to find Garrett Sinclair in the foyer, chatting with Cecilia. He turned as they entered, his smile warm, but his eyes calculating as they swept over Eliana. There's my favorite patient, he exclaimed, embracing Violetta. Looking better every time I see you. Ms. Valente is taking me to the beach today, Violetta said proudly. Is that wise? Garrett directed the question to Eliana, challenge evident in his tone. Fresh air and supervised activity are part of her treatment plan. Eliana replied evenly. Thaddeus approved it. Did he? Interesting. Garrett checked his watch. Actually, I brought lunch. Your favorite, seafood from Marino's. You didn't need to do that, Eliana said, reluctance evident in her voice. The beach would have to wait. Over lunch, Garrett dominated the conversation, regaling Violetta with stories of her father's college days while subtly interrogating Eliana about her background. His questions seemed innocent, but Eliana recognized the pattern. He was verifying information, checking for inconsistencies. Boston Memorial, he repeated when she mentioned her previous employment. That's where Claire was taken after the accident. Eliana maintained a neutral expression. I worked in the trauma unit there, yes. Such a tragic coincidence. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Thaddeus never mentioned you worked at the same hospital. I don't believe he knows, she said carefully. It hasn't come up, hasn't it? You two seem to spend a lot of time talking. Garrett turned to Violetta. Your father speaks very highly of Ms. Valente in our calls. Violetta beamed. She's helping him too, not just me. Is she now? Garrett's gaze sharpened. How fascinating. After lunch, Violetta complained of fatigue, unusual given her recent energy levels. Eliana helped her to bed, concerned by the sudden pallor in her cheeks. I don't feel good, Violetta whispered as Eliana took her temperature. Just rest. I'll check on you in 30 minutes. Eliana adjusted the monitors, frowning at the readings. Violetta's heart rate was elevated, her blood pressure dropping, signs of a potential reaction. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Garrett, who was emerging from Thaddeus's study. Is she all right? He asked, concern evident in his voice. She's resting. The excitement may have been too much. Eliana studied him carefully. Were you looking for something in Thaddeus's office? Just using the phone to check in with Boston. He smiled smoothly. Well, I should be going. Please give Thaddeus my best. After showing him out, Eliana hurried back to Violetta, whose condition had deteriorated further. She was pale, sweating profusely, her breathing labored. Something's wrong, Eliana muttered, reviewing what could have triggered this sudden decline. The only change had been lunch. The seafood. Could it be an allergic reaction? Violetta, are you allergic to shellfish? She asked urgently. The girl shook her head weakly. Never before. Eliana checked the medication chart. Nothing should have interacted with food. Unless. She examined Violetta's daily medication tray. The pills looked normal, but something nagged at her. Picking up one of the capsules, she opened it, sniffing the contents. No unusual odor, but the powder seemed slightly off color. With growing alarm, she gathered samples of every medication, securing them in sealed bags. Then she called Maxwell. I need you at the house immediately, she said when he answered. Something's wrong with Violetta's medication. I think it's been tampered with. Maxwell arrived 20 minutes later, during which time Eliana had stabilized Violetta with intravenous fluids and anti-nausea medication. These need testing, she told him, handing over the samples. And we need new, sealed medication from the pharmacy. You think someone deliberately tampered with her medication? Maxwell asked incredulously. I think someone's been slowly poisoning her, Eliana said, her voice low. The timing with Garrett's visit, the sudden decline, it can't be coincidence. Maxwell looked troubled. That's a serious accusation, Eliana. I'm not accusing anyone specifically, but someone put surveillance devices in this house, and now Violetta's having symptoms consistent with low-dose toxicity. She glanced at the sleeping girl. Get those tested, and don't tell anyone what we suspect. After Maxwell left, Eliana made a difficult decision. She needed to search Thaddeus's office now, while Violetta was stable and sleeping. If someone was poisoning the girl, the answer might lie in the family's secrets. The study was exactly as Thaddeus had left it, desk organized, computer locked. Eliana went straight to the filing cabinet, searching for anything related to Claire's accident or the helicopter's navigation system. The top drawer contained personal documents, Violetta's birth certificate, Claire's death certificate. The second drawer held company files, neatly labeled. Nothing about the accident, but she found a folder marked Navtech Acquisition, the technology division responsible for the helicopter's navigation system. As she reached for it, her phone rang. Thaddeus. How is she? He asked without preamble. Eliana hesitated, reluctant to worry him while he was hours away. She had a reaction to something. Maxwell is having her medication tested. Reaction to what? His voice sharpened with alarm. We're not sure yet. She's stable now, resting. Eliana closed the file drawer quietly. Garrett visited today. A pause. He wasn't supposed to be in Newport. He brought lunch, spent time with Violetta. She chose her next words carefully. After he left, I found him coming out of your study. The silence that followed was charged with tension. I'm coming home now. Don't let anyone else near Violetta. No one. Thaddeus, wait. Someone put listening devices in my house, and now my daughter's sick after an unexpected visit from my business partner. His voice was ice. Trust no one until I get there. The line went dead, leaving Eliana with the unsettling knowledge that she'd been searching his private files when he called. exactly what she'd reported Garrett for doing. 3 hours later, Thaddeus burst into the mansion, making straight for Violetta's room. Eliana met him in the hallway. "She's sleeping normally now," she assured him. "Vitals stable." The relief on his face was palpable, quickly replaced by determination. Maxwell called. The medication was contaminated with trace amounts of arsenic, enough to cause gradual deterioration without raising immediate alarms. Eliana felt sick. Someone's been poisoning her systematically. Someone with access to her medication, to this house. Thaddeus's eyes blazed with barely controlled fury. Garrett was here today, but he couldn't have been tampering with her medication for weeks. He doesn't live here. No, but he visits regularly. Has access to all areas. Thaddeus ran a hand through his hair, disheveled from the drive. "I need to review the security footage." In his study, they reviewed weeks of recordings, focusing on Violetta's medication preparation. Nothing seemed unusual until Thaddeus suddenly paused the footage from 3 weeks earlier. "There," he said, pointing to Cecilia entering the medication room after hours. "She's not authorized to handle medications." The recording showed the house manager carefully opening capsules, adding something, then resealing them. "God," Thaddeus breathed. "She's worked for me for 5 years. The question is why," Eliana said softly. "And who put her up to it?" Their eyes met, the unspoken suspicion hanging between them. Before they could discuss it further, Maxwell called with the test results. "Low-level arsenic poisoning, consistent with months of exposure," he confirmed. "The new medication is clean. I administered the first dose myself." After he hung up, Thaddeus turned to Eliana, his expression raw. "You saved her life." "I was just doing my job." "No." He stepped closer. "You saw what everyone else missed. You questioned what everyone else accepted." His hand cupped her face gently. "Thank you isn't enough." The intensity in his eyes made her heart race. 3 weeks ago, she'd come to this house seeking answers about Claire's death. Now, she was entangled in a new mystery, and in feelings for a man whose life was still haunted by secrets. "Thaddeus," she whispered, her professional boundaries crumbling. "There's something I need to tell you." Before she could continue, his lips found hers, the kiss conveying everything words couldn't: gratitude, relief, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. Eliana melted into him, her confession momentarily forgotten. Neither noticed the security camera capturing their embrace, or the email automatically sent with the footage to Garrett Sinclair, who smiled coldly at his computer screen in Boston. Well, he murmured. "Time for Plan B." Eliana woke to urgent knocking. Disoriented, she checked the time, 4:17 a.m. She opened her door to find Maxwell, his expression grim. "Thaddeus needs you in his study. Now." She dressed quickly, mind racing. After their kiss the previous evening, Thaddeus had been called away to deal with security matters. They hadn't spoken since. The study door stood open. Inside, Thaddeus sat rigidly behind his desk, a manila folder before him. His face was ashen, eyes cold. "Close the door," he said without looking up. Something in his tone sent a chill through her. Maxwell squeezed her shoulder before leaving them alone. "Is Violetta stable? This isn't about her." Thaddeus finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Or perhaps it is, indirectly." He slid the folder across the desk. Inside were printouts, her employment records from Boston Memorial, staff photos, and a highlighted patient log showing Claire Montgomery's admission to the trauma unit on the day of the crash. "You were there," he said flatly. "You were on duty when Claire died." Eliana's throat went dry. "Yes." 3 years later, "You specifically seek employment in my home, with access to my daughter, to my personal life." His voice remained controlled, but ice cold. "Was any of it real, Eliana? Or was caring for Violetta just your way in?" "It's not what you think." "Then explain why you hid this from me." He tossed another document on the desk, her background check authorization form, where she'd listed hospitals in Providence, but omitted Boston Memorial. "You deliberately concealed your connection to my wife." She stepped forward. "I came here because..." "Because what?" he demanded, standing abruptly. "To spy on me? To gather information?" "For whom?" "For Claire," she said quietly. The name hung between them like a physical presence. "What are you talking about?" he asked, voice dangerously low. "I was with her at the end." Eliana forced herself to meet his gaze. "I was the last person she spoke to." Thaddeus went completely still. "Claire was unconscious when I arrived at the hospital." She regained consciousness briefly before you got there. I was checking her vitals. Eliana took a deep breath. She grabbed my hand and said, "Tell Thaddeus he was right about the system." He was right. The color drained from his face. "That's impossible. You couldn't know those words unless I was there," she finished. "I tried contacting you afterward, but your staff blocked all inquiries. Then I started looking into what the system might mean. So you infiltrated my home under false pretenses." His voice shook with suppressed rage. "Used my daughter's illness as your opportunity." "I came to help Violetta," she insisted. "My credentials are real. My care for her is real." "And us?" he asked, voice cutting. "Was that part of your investigation too?" The question struck like a physical blow. "No, that was unexpected. Unplanned." Thaddeus laughed bitterly. "At least you're honest about something. I discovered reports suggesting Montgomery Technologies received warnings about navigation system failures in the helicopter model Claire used. Warnings that were ignored." Her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I thought you were responsible. I wanted justice for her. So you came to what? Expose me? Punish me?" He advanced around the desk, fury radiating from him. "While developing feelings for me as a convenient side effect?" "I came for truth," she countered. "But the more I learned about you, about this family, the more complex everything became." "The truth," he echoed. "Here's your truth, Eliana. I never saw any warning reports. I was developing surgical robotics, not flight systems. That was Garrett's division." His words confirmed her growing suspicions. "I believe you. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Get out," he cut her off. "Pack your things and be gone by morning." "Thaddeus, please. You used my daughter to get close to me. Exploited our vulnerability. Built my trust under false pretenses." Each accusation landed like a blow. "What does that make you, Eliana?" "Someone who made a mistake," she admitted. "But someone who truly cares about you both. If you care about Violetta, you'll leave without disrupting her recovery further." He turned away. "A new medical team arrives in the morning. She needs consistency. Changing her care now could." "Don't tell me what my daughter needs," he thundered, slamming his hand on the desk. "You forfeited that right when you lied to me from day one." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Eliana spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll go. But first, you need to see something." She removed a flash drive from her pocket and placed it on the desk. The surveillance videos from Violetta's medication room show Cecilia tampering with the pills, but they don't show who gave her instructions. She maintained eye contact. "Yesterday, I traced calls from the house phones. Cecilia called the same Boston number repeatedly, Garrett's private line." Thaddeus stared at the drive. "Why would Garrett? The navigation system that failed in Claire's helicopter is being implemented in the Meridian merger emergency vehicles," she continued. "If there are known defects, that liability would destroy both companies and him." "You think Garrett was responsible for Claire's death?" Disbelief warred with horror in his voice. "I think he knew about the defects and buried the reports. I think Claire discovered this." Eliana stepped closer. "And now that Violetta's improving, he's worried she might remember something she overheard before getting sick." Thaddeus sank back into his chair, the weight of her words visibly crushing him. "You're asking me to believe my oldest friend betrayed me, killed my wife, and tried to poison my daughter. I'm asking you to look at the evidence." She pointed to the drive. "Review the call logs. Check Garrett's division's internal communications from before Claire's accident. The truth is there." For a long moment, he stared at the flash drive, conflict evident in his expression. Then he looked up at her, eyes hard. "Even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't excuse your deception. You should have told me from the beginning." "You're right," she acknowledged. "I was wrong to keep that from you. But my feelings for you and Violetta are real, Thaddeus. They became real along the way." He turned away. "Pack your things. I'll have security escort you out in an hour." "Violetta will ask for me," she said softly. "I'll handle my daughter. That's no longer your concern." The dismissal was final. In her room, Eliana packed quickly, tears blurring her vision. She wrote a note to Violetta explaining her sudden departure as family emergency, unable to bear the thought of the girl believing she'd been abandoned. As a security guard led her to the front door, she heard Violetta's voice from upstairs, calling for her. The sound broke something inside her. Outside, dawn was just breaking over the Atlantic, the beauty of it a cruel contrast to the pain tearing through her chest. "Ms. Valente," the guard said awkwardly. For what it's worth, I've never seen the little miss so happy as these past weeks. She nodded, unable to speak, and walked to her car. Behind her, in his study, Thaddeus Montgomery inserted the flash drive into his computer, his world fracturing further with each document he opened. Call logs, emails, financial transfers to Cecilia. And worst of all, the internal report from 3 years ago, warning of critical failures in the navigation system, with Garrett's signature acknowledging receipt. The same navigation system being implemented in the Meridian merger vehicles. The system Claire had expressed concerns about before her final flight. The system she'd tried to warn him about with her dying breath. By the time Thaddeus looked up from the evidence, tear tracks marred his face. Through the window, he watched Eliana's car disappear down the driveway. He'd lost Claire to betrayal, and now, through his own stubborn pride, he might have lost the woman who had brought life back to his home and to his heart. His phone rang. Garrett's name flashed on the screen. Good news, his oldest friend said when he answered. Meridian CEO signed off on everything. We're moving forward with full implementation of the navigation systems next month. Thaddeus's grip tightened on the phone, his voice carefully controlled as he stared at the evidence of Garrett's treachery. Excellent. We should celebrate. Dinner at my place tonight. Perfect. I've been meaning to check on Violetta anyway. The false concern in Garrett's voice was sickening now that Thaddeus knew the truth. Is that nurse still giving you trouble? No, Thaddeus said coldly. She's gone. Eliana's apartment in Providence felt alien after weeks at the Montgomery estate. She paced restlessly, phone in hand, tempted to call Maxwell for updates on Violetta. Professional ethics warred with personal concern. Her phone rang, an unknown number. They fired Violetta's new nurse already, Maxwell said without preamble. She's refusing medication, food, everything. Keeps asking for you. Thaddeus made his decision. Eliana replied, heart aching. He's reviewing everything on that drive you left. Hasn't slept. Maxwell lowered his voice. Garrett's coming for dinner tonight. Thaddeus is planning something. What? That's too dangerous. If Garrett suspects. I know. That's why I'm calling. He's not thinking clearly. After hanging up, Eliana stared at her research wall. Newspaper clippings, flight records, corporate documents. 3 years of investigation, now culminating in a dangerous confrontation. She couldn't let Thaddeus face this alone. At the Montgomery estate, Violetta's condition deteriorated rapidly. The monitors beside her bed displayed alarming vitals as Thaddeus held her hand. I want Ms. Valente, she whispered, eyes glassy with fever. I know, sweetheart. How could he explain that he'd sent away the one person who truly helped her? She had to leave. Because she made you smile again? Violetta's unexpected perception cut through him. Dad, I heard you laughing with her. I haven't heard that since Mom. Before he could respond, Maxwell entered. Garrett just called. He'll be here in an hour. Cancel it, Thaddeus said, looking at his daughter's pale face. Violetta needs me. You can't back out now. He's already suspicious. Maxwell checked Violetta's monitors. This fever's concerning. The new medication could be tampered with too. Thaddeus finished grimly. Nothing's safe anymore. There's another option. Maxwell hesitated. Eliana developed a detailed treatment protocol. It's in Violetta's file. I can't trust anything she did. Can you afford not to? Maxwell asked quietly. Downstairs, security alerted Thaddeus to an approaching vehicle, not Garrett's luxury sedan, but a modest compact car. The surveillance feed showed Eliana at the gate, arguing with the guard. Let her in, Thaddeus ordered, surprising himself. In the foyer, they faced each other, tension crackling between them. Maxwell called me, she said. Violetta's condition is deteriorating, he finished. Why are you really here? To stop you from confronting Garrett alone. Her eyes held his, unflinching. He's already tried to kill Violetta. He won't hesitate to eliminate you too. I need to hear him admit what he did to Claire. And what about your daughter? Eliana challenged. She needs you alive more than she needs closure. Something in her words penetrated his anger. I've alerted the authorities. They're monitoring the situation. Not good enough. Eliana reached for his arm. Thaddeus, I've been investigating Claire's death for 3 years. I have evidence beyond what I gave you. Enough to ensure Garrett's conviction without risking your life. Their conversation was interrupted by a security alert. Garrett had arrived early. Thaddeus's expression hardened. Go to Violetta. Help her. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was permission. I'll handle Garrett. Thaddeus, please. His voice softened. Whatever lies between us, she needs you. Upstairs, Eliana found Violetta burning with fever, her breathing labored. She immediately recognized the symptoms, not disease progression, but acute poisoning. When did this start? She asked the attending nurse. After her medication this morning. Dr. Reed approved the doses. Eliana examined the pill bottles. They appeared sealed, pharmaceutical grade. Then she noticed water droplets on the rim of Violetta's glass. Testing a drop on her finger, she detected a faint bitter taste. Give me activated charcoal and call Dr. Reed immediately, she ordered. Her water's been contaminated. Meanwhile, Thaddeus greeted Garrett in the study, maintaining a facade of normalcy while recording their conversation. The Meridian deal is our legacy, Garrett was saying, pouring himself a drink. Your vision, my execution. Like the navigation system in Claire's helicopter? Thaddeus asked casually. Garrett's hand stilled momentarily. That was a tragic accident. Was it? Thaddeus slid a document across the desk, the safety report with Garrett's signature. You knew about the defects months before her crash. Garrett's expression flickered between shock and calculation. Where did you get this? Does it matter? I know everything, Garrett. The reports you buried. The corners you cut to meet deadlines. You don't understand, Garrett said, voice hardening. The delays would have cost us the government contracts. Millions in revenue. My wife's life was worth more than your profit margins, Thaddeus spat. Claire was going to expose everything, Garrett admitted, mask falling away. She found the reports, threatened to go public. The crash was convenient. And Violetta? Why poison my daughter? She overheard Claire on the phone that day, talking about the reports. Garrett's smile turned sinister. Children repeat things at the most inconvenient times. I couldn't risk it. Thaddeus fought to control his rage. The authorities have everything. It's over. Is it? Garrett reached into his jacket, revealing a small pistol. I think not. A murder-suicide perhaps? Grieving widower, unable to handle his daughter's illness. You won't get away with this. I already have, for 3 years. Garrett gestured with the gun. Upstairs. Your daughter should join you for this family finale. As they reached the second-floor landing, Eliana emerged from Violetta's room, freezing at the sight of the weapon. Perfect timing, Garrett said coldly. The dedicated nurse returns. You've been quite troublesome, Ms. Valente. The police are on their way, she said calmly, positioning herself between him and Violetta's door. Your security codes have been deactivated, Garrett. There's no escape. His laugh was chilling. Always so many steps behind. Did you really think I came alone? Outside, gunfire erupted as Garrett's hired security engaged with the estate's guards. The distraction was momentary, but enough. Thaddeus lunged for the gun. In the struggle, a shot rang out. Eliana watched in horror as both men tumbled down the grand staircase, the gun skittering across marble floors, Thaddeus's body motionless at the bottom. Time slowed to a crawl as Eliana raced down the grand staircase, her medical training overriding the panic threatening to consume her. At the bottom, Thaddeus groaned, alive but bleeding profusely from a shoulder wound. Garrett lay nearby, his neck bent at an unnatural angle, eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. Don't move, she instructed Thaddeus, tearing off her cardigan to apply pressure to his wound. Help is coming. Stay with me. His eyes found hers, clouded with pain but intensely focused. Violetta is stable. I neutralized the poison in time. Relief washed over his face as sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. I won't lose either of you, she whispered, fighting back tears. Maxwell burst through the front door, face ashen at the sight before him. Ambulances are 3 minutes out. Police right behind them. The next hours passed in a chaotic blur of police statements, paramedics working efficiently, and crime scene investigators combing through the mansion. By dawn, the full truth had emerged. Garrett's hired security team had been intercepted by federal agents acting on evidence Eliana had submitted weeks earlier, a parallel investigation she'd initiated as insurance, never fully trusting that Thaddeus would believe her findings. In Newport Hospital's private wing, Thaddeus awoke to find Eliana asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting near his on the crisp white sheets. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, her normally neat appearance rumpled from hours of vigilance. He studied her face in the soft morning light, reconciling the conflicting emotions that had tormented him since discovering her initial deception: betrayal, gratitude, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. "You saved us both," he said when she stirred, eyes blinking open to find him watching her. "We saved each other." Her eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion, but her gaze was steady. "The evidence from my investigation, combined with your recording of Garrett's confession, ensures justice for Claire. The authorities found additional documents in his home safe. He'd been embezzling for years." A nurse interrupted with news that Violetta was awake and asking for both of them. In her hospital room, the girl's pale face lit up at the sight of Eliana, a genuine smile breaking through the fatigue evident in her features. "You came back," she said simply, extending her thin hand toward the nurse who had become so much more. "I never really left," Eliana replied, taking Violetta's hand between both of hers, fighting to keep her composure. "I'm so proud of how strong you've been." Thaddeus watched the interaction from the doorway, struck by the genuine bond between them. Whatever Eliana's initial motives had been in coming to his home, her love for his daughter was undeniable, as real as the tears now tracking down her cheeks. 2 days later, the authorities confirmed what they already knew. Garrett had orchestrated Claire's death, falsified accident reports, and systematically poisoned Violetta to prevent her from recalling crucial conversations she had overheard between her mother and Garrett in the days before the crash. She remembered hearing them argue about the system failures, Thaddeus told Eliana as they walked slowly through the hospital's meditation garden, his arm resting in a sling, healing. Claire had discovered internal reports and threatened to take the defects directly to the aviation authority. And he couldn't let that happen, Eliana finished, her fingers lightly touching a flowering bush as they passed. The Meridian deal would have made those same defective systems standard in emergency vehicles nationwide. The casualties could have been in the hundreds. A legacy of death, not innovation. Thaddeus stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I owe you an apology, Eliana. I reacted from pain, not reason. I should have listened. I should have told you about Boston Memorial from the beginning," she admitted, meeting his gaze. "Fear kept me silent. Fear you wouldn't let me help Violetta if you knew why I was really there. Would you have eventually told me? If we hadn't fallen for each other," she supplied gently when he hesitated. "Yes. I was trying to find the right moment when everything exploded. I never expected to care for you both so deeply." He reached for her hand with his good arm, his touch tentative. "I don't know how to trust again, but I want to try. One day at a time," she suggested, lacing her fingers with his. Starting with Violetta's recovery. 6 months later, the Montgomery estate underwent a transformation as dramatic as its inhabitants. Gone were the imposing security measures and perpetually darkened rooms. Sunlight streamed through open windows, and laughter, once an alien sound within those walls, echoed in the once silent hallways. Violetta, fully recovered and thriving, practiced guitar on the stone terrace while Eliana tended the newly planted garden below. From his study window, Thaddeus watched them, marveling at how completely his life had changed in a single year. The federal investigation into Montgomery Technologies had revealed the full extent of Garrett's corruption, falsified safety reports, embezzlement spanning a decade, and corporate espionage targeting competitors. The company had emerged cleansed but humbled, with Thaddeus steering it toward innovative medical technologies instead of navigation systems. More meaningful than the company's transformation was the Claire Montgomery Foundation, established to fund research into rare autoimmune disorders like Violetta's and to provide support for affected families. The foundation's first major gala was scheduled for the coming weekend, exactly 1 year after Eliana first arrived at their door. That evening, as sunset painted the Atlantic gold and crimson, Thaddeus found Eliana in the library, surrounded by medical journals and grant applications. "Still working?" he asked, sitting beside her on the leather sofa where they had first truly talked during that long-ago thunderstorm. "Reviewing cases for the Foundation's first research grants." She leaned into him naturally, their physical ease with each other the result of months of healing, both physical and emotional. "There are so many families struggling with what we went through. I have something to ask you," he said, suddenly serious. "Something I've been considering for a while now." Her expression turned cautious, a shadow of old wariness crossing her face. That sounds ominous. Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside nestled a sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds, its deep blue reminiscent of the ocean they both loved, visible through the library windows. "I once thought I couldn't survive losing someone I loved," he said quietly, emotion making his voice rougher than usual. "Then I nearly lost Violetta, and you showed me how to fight for what matters. How to live again, not just exist." Tears filled Eliana's eyes as he continued, taking the ring from its box. "We found each other in darkness, built trust through truth, painful as it was." He took her hand, his own slightly trembling. "Eliana Valente, will you marry me? Be Violetta's mother, my partner, for whatever comes next." "Yes," she whispered, hands trembling as he slipped the ring onto her finger. 1,000 times yes. Their kiss sealed more than a proposal. It marked the culmination of a journey from suspicion to trust, from grief to joy, from broken to whole. The following Saturday, standing beside Thaddeus as he officially opened the foundation gala, Eliana spotted Violetta beaming at them from the front row. The teenager wore a pendant containing a small piece of Claire's favorite jewelry, a connection to the mother she'd lost and a blessing for the family they were becoming. "From tragedy, we find purpose," Thaddeus told the gathered donors, his voice strong with conviction. "From loss, renewal. And sometimes, if we're fortunate, from our deepest pain comes our greatest joy." His eyes met Eliana's across the crowded room, and in that gaze was everything they'd survived together, and everything they had yet to build. "The Claire Montgomery Foundation stands as a testament to a remarkable woman's legacy," he continued, "and to the healing power of truth, no matter how difficult that truth might be to face." Later that night, after Violetta had fallen asleep and the last guests had departed, Thaddeus and Eliana stood on the cliffside terrace overlooking the ocean. The same waves that had carried Claire's helicopter to its tragic end now crashed rhythmically against the shore, a reminder of life's constant movement forward. "I used to stand here and feel nothing but emptiness," Thaddeus admitted, his arm around Eliana's waist. "Now I see possibilities. Claire sent me to you," Eliana said softly. "Her last words led me here, though I never could have imagined where that path would lead." "Do you think she knew? That her final message would bring us together?" Eliana considered this, watching the moonlight play across the water. "I think she wanted justice and peace for the family she loved. We found both, and something more." As if offering its blessing, a warm breeze swept across the terrace, carrying the scent of the roses Eliana had planted in the garden below, Claire's favorites, now blooming again after years of neglect. Outside, the Atlantic crashed against Newport's rugged shores, constant and changing all at once. Like love itself, powerful enough to heal the deepest wounds, persistent enough to erode the hardest barriers, and vast enough to embrace both what was lost and what remained to be discovered. In Thaddeus's embrace, watching the eternal dance of moonlight on water, Eliana felt the completion of a circle. She had come seeking truth for one woman and found a family in need of healing. In saving them, she had saved herself, transforming loss into love, suspicion into trust, and endings into beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new patience for her growing practice, new challenges for Thaddeus's reformed company, and new adventures for Violetta's reclaimed childhood. But tonight belonged to the three of them, a family forged in fire, tempered by truth, and finally, gloriously reborn.